massacre in Orlando has been covered from a myriad points of perspective. A gay story, an Islamic story, a terrorism story, a gun control story. Long after all those stories have moved to the second page of the newspaper or online, we will begin to say, what does it mean and what are the legal ramifications? To talk about that with me, our guest, Kendell from the National Center for Lesbian Rights. It's always a great pleasure to have you here.
I'm very happy to be here, David. Thank you.
You know, it's Pride Week, so we're all busy. We're all busy anyway, but I don't know about you, but the last 10 days to me have been kind of out of time. Everyone I've spoken to as a member of the community seems to have a very personal reaction to Orlando. What was your reaction?
That morning, was at the airport with my family, about to head off on a family vacation, and all I saw on CNN was the first crawl as we boarded the flight at SFO, shooting at Orlando nightclub, and that's all it said. And I thought, you know, Sandy and I looked at each other and shook our heads like, oh my God, something again. And we boarded the plane, and then at the layover in LA is when I started seeing in my news feed and on the news that it was actually a gay nightclub, focusing mostly on the Latino community, and that at that point they were saying 29 people had lost their lives. We now know it was almost, it was 49 total. Mm-hmm. And it was such an odd and surreal experience to be getting on a plane to go on vacation with my family, a long-awaited vacation that we were all looking forward to, with clearly this new reality and an unprecedented reality for our community, was just a companion on really the entire vacation. We talked about it as a family. I couldn't stop looking at the news and connecting with my staff about what we could do, what statements we could make. It just felt like, and still does, that we'll never be the same. And there's a grief in that, to the extent we had any innocence left as a community that has been marginalized and attacked in many different ways, and we've had seen certainly our share of murders. This is a whole different level, and to the extent there was any sense of innocence or a sense that maybe we turned a corner and we're moving in a different direction, that is now gone, and it now feels that it is very somber and we've been shattered.
Yeah, you know, I mean, sitting here watching you, and I've been this way all day, we've done several interviews, I see you misty-eyed. I am too. I just, you know, all week I have been on the cusp of tears, and sometimes I've begun to wonder, am I making too much of this? Is this the big deal that it seems to me and so many people, and why is that?
Well, I think it is a really big deal, and I think part of where my emotion comes from in talking about it, I spent a vacation talking about it with my family, but to a more modest extent, because I didn't want my children to feel like this was going to dominate every day. But this is really the first time in speaking with you that I've actually articulated out loud some of my thoughts about it. So processing that in some ways for me for the first time in a deeper way rather than just in my own head has something to do with it. I think there's also this sense that, what does it mean? Mm-hmm. What do we do now? What do we do with this? We know the stories of so many of these 49 victims. And the other thing that I think we really feel is I did not know any of these 49 who were murdered personally, but I did. I grew up with them. I was at clubs just like they were, especially growing up in the 70s and 80s with a fake ID that I used to get into the only gay club at the time in Salt Lake City, the place where I felt I could hold my girlfriend's hand. The sense of freedom, the sense of belonging, the sense that we were all family in that space. And I know that even though we've moved beyond the place where the bar was the only place we feel safe, there is no doubt in my mind that at Pulse that night, it felt like family. Mm-hmm. People felt safe, and they were celebrating, and they were reveling in their bodies and in their community and dancing, and it just, to have that so violated is something I think we all recognize ourselves in what happened there.
You know, there has been a lot written over the last however many years it was since the Milk Moscone assassinations, but many people and scholars have said that if Dan White had just killed the mayor, he'd have been given life in prison or the chair. And there was that kind of weird marriage of Harvey and his breaking down on the stand, you know, this poor straight guy that was upset about Harvey being gay that meant he got 5 years. Now we go 30, 40 years later. Do you think some of what has been the reaction to Orlando is because it is the quote-unquote single worst account or occasion of gun violence in this country ever? Is it the merging of those two things that make it so incredible, or is it enough that it was just an attack on our community?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's a little bit of both. I do think that this is a mass shooting unlike anything our community has experienced. And I think it's important to note that there have been other mass murders where more lives were taken for sure, and some that we don't even know about. African Americans who were targeted for attack, Indian Americans. And so I feel like we all just have to have a sense of perspective and history. But certainly for our community, this is the worst mass death that we have seen in our community at the hands of a lone killer. And I do feel like that does put it in a different place. And at the same time, you know, we also understand that we're still in a struggle. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow, we will celebrate 1 year since we won marriage.
Oh no, marriage equality.
Marriage
tomorrow.
Equality in this country.
Which you were here a year ago talking about.
That high watershed mark. Yes, it's 1 year since Charleston this week. But, and so isn't that just, even that you went to Charleston and I was talking about marriage, that's the perfect juxtaposition of what it means to live in a very complicated and dynamic cultural nation where you can have something like winning marriage a year ago in the same week you had a Charleston, and now a year later you celebrate the 1 year of winning the freedom to marry nationwide. At the same time, we mourn the loss of 49 members of our community in an unprecedented attack. And I think this push-pull of what kind of nation are we, and where are we going to end up, and are we actually going to really revitalize principles of dignity and justice and integrity and belonging for everyone, or are dark forces going to continue to intrude? I feel like that is the national struggle that we're in.
You know, hearing you talk about it with such passion, though, I hear a sense of optimism in your voice.
I am optimistic. I actually, I don't know. I don't feel very, I have to say, I'm not sure I feel very optimistic after Orlando. And at the same time, I just feel like we rise above. We find a way to rise above again and again. And I think with Pride coming up, we're going to come together certainly in a more somber way than we've previously come. But I feel like we have to say, no matter what, mm-hmm. we are going to continue to fight. Mm-hmm. You are not going to break us. You'll shatter us, and we'll have to maybe pick the pieces up and glue ourselves back together. But we will rise again. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, forces of, whether it's internalized homophobia, whether it's terrorism, whether it's just pure hate, whether it's religious bigotry, they win. And then all those victims in Orlando, mm-hmm. there will be more victims to follow. We have to say that's the last time. Mm-hmm. It's never going to happen again.
So, you know, I have noticed, I mean, I've been like you, the last time, and not to equate the two, but just saying how I feel, the last time I had this sense of a weird miasma was after 9/11, when I both didn't want to look at the TV, but I couldn't not look at it. I mean, I've read every blog post, every little story about the 49. At what point does this become part of our history that we make part of our narrative? I mean, is this, you know, is it 2 weeks on? Is it a month on? Is it until the next one? I mean, you know, are we now just, is our guard back up? You know, for a year did we say, okay, we had marriage equality, so everyone loves us now. And now we realize, no, actually there's some people who hate us.
Well, I think we've known since the day of the marriage ruling that we have people who hate us. That's not going to change. We're always going to have a certain segment that will hate us, fueled by religious bigotry, fueled by just pure hatred of anything different. And that's always existed. And it's existed for every community. Mm-hmm. We're not alone. Women, Catholics, the Irish, African Americans, Indians, all people of color. I mean, you know, every single group has this up and down history trying to come to the end of a road that means equality and justice and inclusion and belonging, and no one has yet made it there all the way. But I do feel like for Orlando to mean anything, and for those victims, for that horror to mean something that you can actually hang on to and not feel completely despondent by, we have to enact sane gun control in this country.
All right, so let's go.
We have to get rid of racism. We have to attack the isms that make people marginal, and we have to attack the weapons that allow those isms to be lethal.
Okay, so let's talk about that before we get to the end of the first half. What is the impact of Orlando on gun control or access to guns or whatever? You know, just at the beginning of this day, the Democrats, many in the Democrats in the House ended their sit-in for the moment. I don't think anyone doubts that came about as a direct result of Orlando, but I personally found it significant that the first person to sit down was the icon of the Black Civil Rights Movement, John Lewis. You know, where does Orlando fit within this struggle? Well,
you know, look, John Lewis was at the Woolworth's counter saying, we will not allow Jim Crow laws and this segregation of African Americans to stand any longer. And in some ways, John Lewis is on the floor, literally sitting on the floor of the House of Representatives saying, we will no longer allow these killings to happen. And we sit around and wring our hands and put out pithy comments about our thoughts and prayers, and yet we do nothing to change policy. It is insane in this country that anyone can walk into a gun store and get a magazine that holds 30 or 50 or 100 bullets and walk out. That is insane. We should have an assault weapons ban in this country.
Well, and we did. So what happened after 2005?
With that, well, it wasn't reauthorized for who knows what political calculation people make. I feel like what last night, what the sit-in did, and what the rally outside of the Capitol did, and maybe what Orlando will do, is something that Charleston didn't do, that Sandy Hook didn't do. Maybe it will finally force lawmakers to understand that we are in charge, not the NRA, of gun policy.
Meaning we the people.
We the people in this country. We're in charge of the policies that will determine how many guns are available and who they're available to, not the NRA. I finally believe that if anything could maybe make a change, you start to see cracks in the fissure of that impenetrable wall of protection that has surrounded the NRA for the first time.
We'll be right back more with our conversation with Kate Kendell about the continuing fallout from Orlando. We'll be right back. And welcome back. I'm David Perry, and you're watching 10%. Our continuing interview with Kate Kendell about the ramifications of Orlando. You know, it's interesting how these things get a name. You know, there's 9/11, and now just Orlando is no longer the happiest place on earth. I think it'll always be known as Orlando. You've been in touch, obviously, with some people from Orlando. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, it is true that one thing that our community can certainly do is mobilize when it has to. And just in the hours after news of the shooting broke, dozens of groups came together on emergency conference calls and in email chains to ask what could we do. And what we were all asking, those of us not in Florida, were asking Florida-based organizations and organizations in Orlando, what do you need? And so Nadine Smith, who's the Executive Director of Equality Florida, the Central Florida LGBT Center, all now are saying that rallying, that sense of support, that sense of help, as Nadine wrote in an email, it has helped us pick up the pieces of our broken heart. And what we've seen in the wake of that is millions of dollars raised, funds that will go directly to the victims and their families to help with whether it's funeral expenses, to help with family expenses in the wake of maybe the loss of a main wage earner. As legal organizations, we're putting together information, all of us, along with private firms, kind of a toolkit of things to help families navigate some of the legal issues they might need to navigate. I mean, keep in mind, these were by and large very young victims in their 20s and 30s.
The oldest victim was 50, younger than I am.
And they may well be people who never thought about things like a will or an estate or a trust or anything like that. But yet they have assets, and we want to make sure that they are protected, and that whatever their wishes might have been, as best as we can determine them, those wishes will be followed, and that their families will have some resources and some protection. And so I do feel like everyone kind of put aside whatever institutional interests sometimes exist to just laser focus on what do you need, and that was the question. And when the answer came back, that was answered with resources to really show up for that community.
Yeah, you know, something that just came up while you were saying that I recall, and as a gay man, hit me a lot, and Alfredo and I, my husband, got very emotional about, was the first question of what do we need was blood. And then the answer was, oh, well, I can't give blood. It reminds me of, like, in Virginia when I was a boy, you couldn't serve a drink to a homosexual. So, you know, you just went up and asked for a drink. But then if I went up and said I'm gay, well, no, you can't have a bourbon. So, I mean, how many people go into a blood bank and say I'm gay?
Yeah, well,
I mean,
but of course they asked the question. I mean, we have this ridiculous law that men who have had sex with men within the last 10 years cannot donate blood, and yet.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
Well, no, you could laugh at it, and then you see it in light of this tragedy, and there's this blood shortage, and you're like, that is insane. You could have a gay man in a monogamous relationship for years, unable to give blood, and yet a non-gay man could walk in who has multiple sexual partners every week, unprotected sex. He's never asked that question, and he can give blood. This is not based in science. This ban is a vestige of homophobia at its worst from years ago. The FDA made some improvements in it, but it still is toxic and terrible, and this is a perfect example of how inane and ridiculous it is. So I do feel like, you know, there may be some positive things that could come out of Orlando. It focuses on how insane our gun laws are. It focuses attention on this inane and ridiculous and anti-scientific ban on gay men giving blood. If we could get real policy changes, and maybe those 49 people will not have died in vain.
So, you know, I said you were an optimist, and I do believe that, because I think to do the work you do, you have to kind of get up and say, well, I think I can do it again today. But how much real change do you think is going to happen? And what do you think some of those real legal changes are going to be?
Well, I think how much change happens is determined by we the people. I do feel like there is a thirst in this country to feel like our voice matters. I mean, you have to have some way to account for the rise of Donald Trump. And part of how you can account for the rise of Donald Trump is people feeling like he will listen to me. Politicians, those professional class politicians, won't listen to me. He will listen to me, therefore I will have more of an influence over policies that impact my life. Now, I have my own critique, and many do, about whether that would actually be true or not. But there is something going on in the country where people do feel disenfranchised from making a meaningful difference day to day and intersecting with their government. I feel like this experience, what's happened with Orlando, and what's happened with the Democratic response to the failure to pass any sane gun laws that protect us, is that people are saying enough. No, we want our country back, and we want a country that reflects our values and that has policies that we support. And I feel like we're just seeing maybe the beginnings of that.
Well, you know, and not to play devil's advocate, but I'm an optimist too, but it seems like what happened with the Democrats sitting down on the floor only made the Republicans more polarized. I mean, if we have to wait for every time 49 people get mowed down by an assault weapon to focus on gun laws, we're never going to pass any laws.
Well, I'll tell you what, November is just around the corner.
All right, so good. You got me to my last question in our last few minutes. What is the impact of Orlando on the election? And by that election, I mean federally, state, and local.
Well, I think a couple of things, and I want to be clear. NCLR is a 501c3. We do not endorse candidates, but we definitely endorse values and we endorse a vision and a sense of what kind of country do we want to live in. And I feel like events like Orlando, or even this morning, the Supreme Court issued two rulings, enormously important rulings, one upholding a very modest affirmative action plan at the University of Texas, which we very much applaud, and the other, in that 4-4 deadlocked vote, upheld the striking down by the Fifth Circuit of Obama's very modest protections on deferral of removal for parents of childhood arrivals, the immigration policies that make so much more sense to treat people sanely and decently, which our immigration policies do not. That Supreme Court vote was deadlocked because we're missing a Supreme Court justice. This morning reminds us how much it matters who sits in the White House. Having a justice that would stand on the side of caring about the most vulnerable, having a justice who cares about giving people improved opportunities, having a justice that cares about keeping assault weapons off of our streets and out of our neighborhoods. That's at stake in November. And so you should ask yourself the question, what kind of country do you want to live in? And if you want to live in a country that is inclusive, that values difference and diversity, that celebrates difference, that honors justice, your choice is pretty stark.
So knowing that you can't endorse, what do you think is going to happen?
I think that
We've got about a minute.
I think the community's focus is now laser sharp about how much it matters, how much our elected officials matter, and how imperiled our community is still. So we need to make a choice. First, we need to vote. We need to make absolutely certain that we register people to vote and that we vote. Even the LGBT community votes at a very, very low percentage of our actual numbers. We should register to vote and we should vote. I don't care who people vote for someone that you know will protect and care about our community. If you do that, we're going to be fine.
Thanks, Kate. Always a pleasure.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for watching 10%. And all of you, remember Florida, remember Orlando, and more importantly, remember what you can do for your own community right here at home. We'll see you next week on 10%.